Welcome to Archive Whispers. This is a place to fall asleep. There's nothing here you need to follow, and nothing you need to remember. Let your eyes close whenever they're ready. The words will keep going, soft and slow, through the long night. Settle in, lower the lights, and let the archive open. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time, if this is where we meet. Tonight, the door we will be opening leads us back to the same northern French countryside where, some weeks ago, we walked the slow course of a single autumn day at a small stone manor in the Île-de-France. The fields we passed through then, with their last sheaves brought safely in, are now under a thin first frost, and the bare woods beyond the manor wall, which had only begun to lose their leaves, stand silent against the long gray light of a low northern winter sky. What we are going to do over the long arc of this night is not to witness any of the great events of the period. There will be no battle here, no royal progress, no famine of memorable scale. Instead, we are going to spend the 3 coldest months of the year, from the last of the November rains through the slow, deep silences of January and into the first thin promise of March, in one small village, under the seigneurial protection of that same minor lord whose autumn day we have already kept. We are going to see, in something like real time, how a small medieval community of perhaps 200 souls quietly arranged itself to survive a season that, in its full severity, had every right to kill them. The daily life of these months, like that of the autumn day we have already spent, is not as fully documented as one might wish. What records we do have, surveys of land, lists of dues, the small minutes of the manor court, are written for accounting, not for atmosphere. For the texture of the season itself, we have leaned most on Georges Duby's rural economy and country life in the medieval West, and on Robert Fossier's gentle, patient peasant life in the medieval West, which spends pages on exactly the small repeated work of a winter household. For the weather of these specific decades, we have leaned on Emmanuel Leroy-Laduree's long climate history, times of feast, times of famine, and on the more recent environmental work of Richard Hoffman. The fuller list of sources is in the description below, in case you would like to follow the same path. What we will do then is move slowly through 3 of these months, November, January, and a brief stretch of early March, and let the cold itself, as much as anything, do the telling. We will see the bringing in of the last firewood, the careful arrangement of the small storerooms, the descent of the household into a tighter, lower, smokier kind of life around the kitchen hearth and the great hall fire. We will hear, more often than not, very little. The medieval winter, in places like this, was not the picturesque white scene of later painting. It was a long, gray, damp, slow stretching of cold that dimmed the world, week by week, until something in the light at the end of February very gently began to lengthen again. If you can, dim your lights now. Settle into whatever surface you have chosen for tonight, and let the room around you become, for the next few hours, a little quieter, and a little smaller, and a little further away. I will speak slowly, and I will not raise my voice. There is nothing in what follows that requires you to remember any name, any date, any figure. The villagers we are about to meet do not need to be remembered. They only need to be sat with, for a while, in their cold and their patience. If you fall asleep before the end, that is, in fact, the gentlest compliment you can pay this kind of work. The recording will still be here in the morning, and the small gray village we are about to enter does not mind being left alone. Let us begin. The cold, in a small medieval village on the first true winter morning of the year, settles first into the lower spaces. The barn, the cellar, the small storeroom that opens onto the back of the cottage. These are the parts of the household that have given up their summer warmth most completely, and they will not begin to warm again until the kitchen hearth has been built up properly an hour or so after dawn. So when the first of the villagers begins to wake, in the gray light that comes through the small wooden shutters above the bed, the cottage itself is not yet fully ready to receive him. The packed earth floor is cold to the touch. The wooden door frame creaks softly as it is pushed open from inside. The first to rise, in almost every household in the village, is the good wife. This is not a matter of devotion or of duty, but of necessity. The hearth fire, which has been kept burning low all night under a careful layer of gray ash, banked, in the language of the household, needs to be uncovered, raked open, and built up again before any other work can usefully begin. So at the very first gray light, when somewhere outside a single cockerel has only just begun his slow, uncertain testing of his voice, she rises from the low straw mattress, descends to the kitchen end of the single ground room, kneels at the hearth, and begins the patient work of bringing the fire back into a useful life. The village itself, in this hour, is barely a village. Only the lowest gray light reaches between the houses, and the sounds, when they come, are very small. A single dog testing the cold of the yard with his paws, a goat shifting in the lean-to, attached to one of the larger cottages, the faint distant ring of an iron pail being set down on stone far across the green, beyond the manor wall, where the Lord himself sleeps later than the village. No light shows yet at all, only the faintest curl of pale smoke from the kitchen chimney to suggest that the manor cook, like her village counterparts, has already begun her own slow morning. The manor, beyond the wall, takes a little longer to stir. The Lord himself, like most men of his rank, has slept in a chamber above the great hall, on a low wooden bed with curtains drawn against the cold. The fire in his chamber has gone out hours ago, and the air around him is now nearly as cold as the air outside. The first sign of life from inside the manor will be the kitchen chimney, where the manor cook has already begun her own slow morning work, pale gray smoke rising thinly into the still air, visible from every house in the village that has a view across the wall. The first task that matters in almost every household is the question of firewood. For the next 4 months, perhaps 5, the small, carefully stacked pile against the south wall of each cottage will be all that stands between the family and the slow, indifferent cold. Before any other work begins then, the head of each household pauses at some point in the cold gray morning to count what is there. The stacks are looked at and turned and considered. Wood that has dried well is moved to the inner end. Wood still slightly green is moved out. The question that quietly haunts every such inspection is the same. Is there enough? If there is not enough, or if there is doubt, the answer is the same. A last cutting must be done before the worst of the cold arrives. So, on the colder mornings of late November, small groups of men can be seen leaving the village together, billhooks and small axes over their shoulders, walking the slow path out to the coppice wood that the manor allows them to take from. They do not hurry. The wood is half a mile away, and the cold makes hurry pointless. They walk in single file along the frosted lane, breath rising in small pale clouds, and they say very little. In the coppice, the work is patient and unhurried. The men do not fell standing trees. The Lord's foresters would have something to say about that. They work, instead, along the rows of coppiced hazel and ash that have been carefully managed for generations exactly for this purpose. They cut the long, thin rods at their bases, low against the stump, and they let them fall slowly into the soft, frost-rimed undergrowth. The wood, freshly cut, smells faintly of green sap and cold earth. The men strip the side shoots with the same patient, unhurried strokes and bundle the rods together with lengths of withe. By the middle of the morning, each man has gathered as much as he can reasonably carry, and the slow procession back to the village begins. The bundles, balanced across one shoulder or carried on a small wooden sledge dragged through the wet leaves, are heavy. Backs ache. Hands grow cold even inside thick woolen mittens. Yet no one complains, because there is nothing useful to be done with complaint. This is November in a small village in northern France, and this kind of work is, in its way, ordinary. The wood, when it arrives back at the cottages, is set carefully against the south wall to finish drying, and a little of it is taken inside for tonight. At one end of the village, separately and a little apart, the work of the next 2 weeks concerns a different question altogether. The pig. Each household that has been able to keep one through the long summer of foraging in the beech woods has by now brought it home and fattened it in a small wattle pen behind the cottage. The pig, which has been carefully fed on kitchen scraps and the last of the summer turnips, has reached the heaviest weight it will ever know. And it has also reached the limit of what the household can keep feeding through the winter. So now, in the last cold week of November, the matter must be settled. Pig slaughter, in a small medieval village, is not a private affair. It is a small, quiet, communal occasion, done with a kind of practical respect. One man from each household, usually the most experienced, comes to help. The pig is brought out of the pen in the cold gray dawn, walked slowly to a small clean patch of trampled earth behind the cottage, and is given a small handful of grain to keep its head down. The killing is done quickly, and with as much skill as the household can manage, with a single iron blade. There is no celebration in this. There is only the careful, patient, ancient work of turning a living animal into a winter's worth of food. The next several hours, and indeed the next 2 days, are given over to the careful work of preserving everything that the pig can be made to provide. The largest cuts, the hams, the shoulders, the long sides of bacon, are taken down to the small stone cellar that opens at the back of the cottage, where wooden barrels of coarse salt have been waiting since the autumn salt trade came through the village. The cuts are packed carefully into the barrels, layer by layer, with thick handfuls of salt pressed between them. This is slow, patient work, done mostly in silence, and the smell of cold salted meat begins to fill the small cellar. What cannot be salted is hung instead from the iron rack inside the chimney of the kitchen hearth, where the slow, steady smoke of the household's daily fire will, over the course of the next several weeks, gently cure it. The smaller cuts, the sausages made that same evening, the bundles of intestine carefully washed and tied, the small pieces of fat that will later be rendered into lard for winter cooking, hang there in the dim, warm amber light of the hearth. And as the days pass and the smoke continues its slow, patient work, they darken and dry and grow rich. While the men have been at their wood and the good wife at her salting, the older children have been at the barn. The last of the sheaves of the year, the careful bundles of wheat and rye and oats that were brought in during the harvest in August and September, and that have been waiting under the dry rafters of the barn ever since, are now being moved, slowly, to where they will be needed through the winter. Some are placed close to the threshing floor, where, on rainy days through January and February, the slow work of beating the grain free will be done. Others are set aside for the animals. The threshing itself, in November, is not yet the main business of the day. There will be entire gray weeks in January and February when the steady, slow, rhythmic beat of the wooden flail will fill the barn from morning until the early winter dusk. For now, only a small amount is threshed at a time, enough to keep the household bread oven going, enough to feed the chickens and the geese. The flail rises, falls, rises, falls, a sound that the village has known in every winter for as long as anyone can remember, and that the children of the household, half asleep in the cold loft above the barn, learn before they can speak. Inside the cottage, in the small storeroom that opens off the back of the kitchen, the good wife is doing her own slow, patient inventory. The turnips, lifted from the garden in October and carefully spread on dry straw, are checked one by one for soft spots. Any that show even a faint sign of beginning to spoil are set aside for tonight's pottage. The apples, laid out separately on a wooden shelf so that they do not touch one another, are turned slowly so that no single side rests too long. The few small onions, braided together by their long, dry stalks, hang from the low rafter. None of this is exciting work. It is, however, the work that keeps the family alive. In the colder mornings of the second week of November, almost every household in the village turns its attention, for at least a day or two, to the small, careful work of sealing the cottage against the wind. The wooden shutters that close over the small, unglazed windows are checked for tightness, and any small gap is stuffed with carefully prepared moss or coarse wool. The thatch above is looked at from inside, and any thin patch is reinforced from above with a fresh handful of dry reed. Even the small gaps where the wattle and daub of the wall meet the doorframe are inspected, and small handfuls of fresh mud are pressed gently into anywhere the cold air can be felt to whisper through. The few sheep that the village keeps, there are perhaps 30 in all, kept together in the common fold under the care of one of the older boys, have already been clipped, weeks ago, of the small late summer fleece they could spare. The wool now sits, washed and dried, in carefully folded cloth bags in the upper loft of each household that has been entitled to a share. Through the long evenings of the next 4 months, this wool will be carded and combed and spun and woven and turned slowly into the next year's cloth. For now, it only waits. At the center of the village, beside the small gray stone church, the well that supplies most of the houses sits quiet under its low wooden cover. It has not yet frozen. November is rarely cold enough for that, but the women who come to draw water in the late mornings now bring with them an extra pail, in case there is need to break the thin film of ice that has begun, on the colder mornings, to form across the surface below. Within a few weeks, in the deepest part of January, the well will need to be broken open every morning before anything else can be done. For now, it is only the very first hint of that work to come. Inside one of the larger cottages, the one belonging to the household that has, by custom, the right to brew for several neighbors, a different kind of work is unfolding. The small wooden vats, scrubbed clean in October, are now being filled, slowly and carefully, with the warm, thin first wort of the household's winter beer. The grain has been steeped and gently dried. The small handful of dried herbs and the few precious hops bought from a traveling merchant in September have been added in their proper order, and now the slow, patient work of fermentation begins. For the next 10 days or so, the kitchen of this cottage will smell faintly, comfortingly, of warm fermenting grain. At the manor, on a single gray morning in the third week of November, The small local court that the Lord holds 3 or 4 times a year is called into session for what will be its last sitting before the deep winter. The bailiff has spent the previous week walking the village, quietly noting the small, unresolved questions that have accumulated. A disputed boundary stone, a small unpaid due, a complaint about a wandering goat. The villagers, when summoned, come without much fuss to the small hall above the gate, sit themselves on the long oak benches, and answer the bailiff's slow questions as patiently as they can. None of this is dramatic. It is only the ordinary slow work of keeping a small community in order. By the last days of November, the days have grown so short that the evening lamp must be lit, in most cottages, well before the simple supper of bread and pottage is finished. The cleared table is pushed back against the wall. The children settle close to the warm hearth, and the goodwife or the eldest daughter brings out the small wooden distaff and the simple spindle of carved wood. The spinning of wool into yarn by the warm amber light of the single oil lamp and the dim red glow of the banked fire begins. The slow, patient rotation of the spindle against the thigh, the careful drawing of the fiber, the soft hush of the wool as it gathers. These will be the soundtrack of every evening in this household, from now until early March. In the small gray stone church at the center of the village, the parish priest, who is, in this place, almost as poor as the villagers he serves, rings the small bell for Compline as the last of the gray light leaves the western sky. A few of the older women and 1 or 2 of the more devout men walk slowly down the cold lane to attend. The service is short and entirely in Latin, and the priest's voice in the dim candlelit nave is so low and so practiced that very few of those present try to understand the words. They are not, in any case, required to understand. They are required only to be there and to listen, and to walk slowly home again afterwards through the cold, dark village. As the true dark of the November evening settles fully over the village, the last work of the day is the closing of the doors. The animals, the few chickens, the goat, the household pig now too small to slaughter this year that will be kept for next, the small wiry village dog, are brought in, one by one, to the warm darkness of the lean-to or the back of the cottage. The heavy oak door is then pulled to. The iron bar is dropped into its slot. The wooden shutters are checked one last time. From outside, in the cold blue darkness of the village evening, each cottage now shows only the faintest pinprick of amber light around the edges of its door, and the slow rising trail of pale smoke from its chimney. Inside, in the warm amber glow of the kitchen end of the single ground room, the last quiet work of the day is the banking of the fire. The goodwife, kneeling carefully at the hearth, rakes the bright embers together into a small, low, careful mound at the center of the iron grate. Then, with the same patient, unhurried movement that she has used every evening for as long as she has kept this household, she covers the mound with a thick, careful blanket of gray ash from the side of the hearth. The fire will not die. It will smolder slowly through the long, cold night, holding within itself the small, bright heart of the household's warmth, ready to be uncovered again at the first gray light of tomorrow's morning. And outside, above the small, dark village and the small, dark manor and the small, dark coppice wood beyond, the long, cold November moon rises slowly, very slowly, above the bare oak branches. It is a thin moon, only just past first quarter, and it gives a faint, pale, almost silver light to the frosted thatch and the dark wattle walls and the careful stacks of new firewood against the south sides of each cottage. The wind has dropped. The animals are silent. The villagers, one by one, settle into the cold straw beds of the upper lofts, and the long, slow work of November, almost done, drifts gently, almost imperceptibly, into the longer, deeper, colder work of December that is now, in the soft silvery light, just beginning to arrive. The first true snow of the season in places like this almost always falls during the night. The villagers, asleep in their cold straw beds in the upper lofts of their cottages, do not see it begin. They only know, in the morning, by the strange new quality of the light that reaches through the small gaps in the wooden shutters, a pale, almost silver light, softer than the gray of the previous days, that announces, without sound and without ceremony, that winter has now properly arrived. When the first villager rises and steps to the door and pushes it open against the small weight of fresh snow that has banked itself along the threshold, the world outside has been quietly remade. The lane is white. The thatched roofs of the cottages are white. The wattle walls and the careful firewood stacks against them are white. Even the bare branches of the trees beyond the manor wall, which the day before had been only dark silhouettes against a gray sky, are now traced delicately in pale white powder, and the whole village, in this first hour of the snow, is silent in a way that it has not been since the previous winter. By the second week of December, the days have grown so short that the household must rise in something close to full darkness, and must light the small clay oil lamp on the kitchen table well before the morning's work can begin. The cold midday light, when it finally arrives, is gray and brief, perhaps 5 or 6 hours, on a good day, before it begins, with the same slow patience with which it arrived, to thin once again toward the dimness of the long northern evening. In every cottage, at some point in the second or third week of December, the small, slow question of the candles is quietly considered. The household has, by careful preparation through the autumn, set aside a small store of tallow candles, perhaps a dozen, perhaps 20 in the larger households, to be used through the dark months. They will not last. They are not meant to last. But how slowly they are used, and how many evenings the household can stretch them across, becomes a quiet, ongoing calculation of the season. Where there is rendered pig fat left over from the November work, the good wife may, on one of the longer afternoons, take the time to make a few additional simple candles herself. The fat is melted gently in a small iron pot over the warm amber glow of the hearth, and small lengths of carefully twisted flax or linen are dipped slowly into it, again and again, until each gathers a thick, steady layer of cooling tallow. The work is slow and patient. There is no hurry. The world outside the cottage, in these days, becomes a thing one visits only when one must. The men still go out, in their thick woolen cloaks and their carefully wrapped feet, to tend the animals in the lean-tos behind the houses, to break the surface ice on the well at the center of the village, and to bring in fresh firewood from the south wall. But the long hours of the day are now spent indoors, close to the hearth, in the warm amber light that, by mid-December, has become almost the only light there is. Once a week, in almost every village in the region, a single day is given over to the careful and important work of baking bread. The good wife, or sometimes one of the older girls of the household, rises a little earlier than usual, takes from the storage room the small, careful sack of flour that has been ground at the manor mill the week before, and sets to the slow, patient kneading of the dough. The dough, once worked, is left to rise gently beside the warm hearth, covered with a clean linen cloth. The baking itself is done not in the cottage, but at the small communal oven that the Lord, by old custom, maintains for the use of the village. The oven is a low-domed structure of brick and stone, built into the corner of one of the manor outbuildings, and it is the one place in the village, on a baking day, that is warmer than the great hearth of the manor itself. Each household brings its prepared dough in a covered wooden trough, waits its turn, and slides the loaves carefully onto the long wooden peel that the village's appointed oven keeper uses to set them deep into the warm, dark interior. By the late gray morning, the small loaves, perhaps 4 or 5 for a single household, more for a household with many children, are pulled carefully from the warm oven, set on a wooden tray, and carried slowly back through the cold lanes of the village to the cottages from which they came. The bread, fresh from the oven, smells of warm wheat and faintly of wood smoke, and the small column of pale steam rising from each loaf in the cold air is one of the few things, in mid-December, that has the look of comfort about it. The dairy work, in December, has reached its lowest ebb. The few cows that the village keeps, most households have none at all. Only the better cottagers and the manor itself have, by now, almost stopped giving milk altogether. The small amount that they still provide, in the cold gray mornings, is carefully gathered, and most of it is set aside for the very youngest children, or for any household member who is recovering from a winter illness. The making of cheese, which through the warm months had been almost a daily business, has now slowed almost to a stop. What cheeses were made in the autumn, however, are now stored carefully on wooden shelves in the cool, dark corners of the storage rooms, and each must, every few days, be slowly turned. The good wife, on the colder afternoons, lifts each round of pale wheel cheese in turn, brushes the small bloom of mold from its surface with a clean cloth, and sets it down again on its other side. There is no urgency in the work. The cheeses themselves have weeks yet to age. At the same time, and with the same slow, patient care, the cellar barrels of salted pork from the November slaughter are checked, one by one. The seals are inspected. The brine, where any has settled at the bottom of a barrel, is gently agitated. The largest cuts are turned within their salt beds, so that no single side rests too long. The cellar, by mid-December, smells faintly of cold salt and cured meat, and the good wife, leaving with the small clay lamp held carefully in front of her, closes the heavy oak door behind her with the quiet satisfaction of work properly done. As the last week of December approaches, the village makes its quiet, simple preparations for the great feast of the church year. There is no great change in the rhythm of daily life. There will not be, in this village, any dramatic celebration. The lord of the manor will hold a small dinner for his household and for a few of the more prosperous cottagers, and the parish priest will hold 3 small extra services in the small gray stone church across the green. Otherwise, the work goes on much as before. On the evening of the 24th, in most of the cottages, a single small ceremony is observed. A larger than usual log, an oak log, by old preference sometimes chosen from the firewood stack weeks in advance, is brought in and set carefully into the hearth, and is lit from the smaller embers that have been burning all day. It will be left to burn slowly through the long, cold night, and the household, on this single evening, may sit a little later than usual by the warm amber glow of its larger flame. On the morning of the 25th, the household rises a little earlier than usual and a little more quietly. The Yule log, which is burned down to a steady bed of bright, warm embers through the long night, is gently fed a few new pieces of wood, and the great wide ash that has spread across the hearth is left for the day rather than being raked back, in a small unspoken acknowledgement of the day's particular quietness. At the small gray stone church across the green, the parish priest holds the long Christmas Mass before the cold gray dawn has fully arrived. The nave, lit by a few more candles than usual, glows in a deep warm amber against the cold stone walls, and most of the village, even those who, on ordinary Sundays, would have stayed at home, walk slowly down the cold lane to attend. They stand quietly through the long Latin service, and they walk slowly home again afterwards, through the cold blue light of the December morning, breath rising in small pale clouds before them. The midday meal, in most households, is a little more careful than the daily pottage. A small piece of the salted pork from the November slaughter is brought up from the cellar and cooked slowly with the household's turnips and a small handful of dried herbs. A loaf of the fresh bread from the previous week is set out whole rather than cut in slices. A small cup of the year's beer is poured for each adult, and even the children may have a small, careful taste. There is no feast in any modern sense. There is simply, for an hour, a little more than usual. For the youngest children of the household, there may be, on Christmas morning, a small handful of nuts saved from the autumn, or a single carefully kept apple from the storeroom shelf. There are no other gifts. There are no other ornaments. The day passes quietly, with a sense of small, simple comfort, and by the late afternoon, the household is already settling back into the ordinary slow rhythm of the dark winter weeks. By the end of the first week of January, the great feast of Christmas has slipped, almost imperceptibly, back into memory, and the daily life of the village has returned, with very little adjustment, to its ordinary slow, patient rhythm. The firewood is counted, the hearth is banked, the candles are used carefully, the dough is kneaded, the bread is carried home from the communal oven. The spinning continues in the warm amber glow of the evening hearth. What does begin in the second week of January is a noticeable deepening of the cold. The gray, damp cold of November, which had only suggested winter, has now hardened into something colder and stiller. The mornings are sharper. The cold mist that drifts low across the village green is now sometimes touched with fine ice crystals that catch the faintest gray light. The well, which through December had only formed a thin film of ice overnight, now must be properly broken open every morning before water can be drawn. From the cold lane outside, the manor wall, which through the autumn had been only a thing of pale weathered limestone against the gray sky, is now traced along every horizontal surface and every weathered ledge in pale white snow. The single thin trail of smoke that rises from the kitchen chimney is the only sign, on the colder mornings, that the manor is still alive. The villagers, when they walk past on their errands, do not pause to look. The wall is, after all, only what it has always been. From a small rise just outside the village, on a still cold January morning, the smoke trails from the cottage chimneys can be seen rising in slow, careful columns into the gray sky. 20 or 30 of them, each thin and pale, each marking a household where the good wife has already begun her morning at the hearth. The pattern is one that the village has known in every winter for as long as anyone alive can remember. By the middle of January, the days have grown so short that the small clay oil lamp on the kitchen table must be lit, in most cottages, well before the midday meal is over, and must be kept burning steadily through the long, slow afternoon. The lamp does not give very much light. It is, however, enough to spin by, enough to mend by, enough to peel a turnip by, and that, in this season, is enough. And in the warm amber glow of the kitchen end of the cottage, at the end of every long, cold January day, the same slow, patient work of banking the fire is done. The bright embers are gathered carefully into a small, low mound. The thick blanket of pale gray ash is drawn carefully across them, and the fire is left to smolder slowly, holding within itself the small, bright heart of the household's warmth, ready to be uncovered again at the first gray light of tomorrow's morning. And outside, above the small dark village and the small dark manor and the small dark coppice wood beyond, the long cold January moon rises slowly above the bare oak branches and gives a faint, pale, silvery light to the snow-covered thatch and the dark wattle walls and the careful stacks of firewood that have now grown noticeably smaller against the south sides of each cottage. The wind is still, the animals are silent, and the long, slow work of December and early January, almost done, drifts gently, almost imperceptibly, into the deeper, colder, harder work of true midwinter that is now, in the soft, silvery light, just beginning. By the third week of January, the cold has reached the point at which it is no longer merely cold, but rather a kind of slow, patient presence in the village, settled into every wall, every flagstone, every wooden beam, and every careful joint of every cottage in the place. The villagers no longer speak of it. They have, by this point in the winter, no useful words left for it. They simply move within it and arrange their long, slow days around it, and trust the small, bright heart of the hearth to keep them, by very small margins, alive. The well at the center of the village, by this point, is properly frozen. The thin film that had formed across its surface in early January has now grown into a thick, steady plate of pale gray ice, and the small wooden cover that is set over the well at night does not, any longer, prevent the ice from forming, but only slightly slows it. Every morning, then, the village's first true work is the careful and patient breaking of this ice, usually done by one of the older boys of the village, with a small, heavy iron mallet kept beside the well exactly for this purpose. The breaking of the well ice is not done with any urgency, or with any of the small dramatic gestures that the work might seem, to a modern observer, to call for. It is done slowly, with the same patient, unhurried rhythm with which every other ordinary task in this place has always been done. 3 or 4 small, careful strokes of the iron mallet against the edge of the ice plate, a slow, patient lifting away of the broken pieces, a final dipping of the small wooden pail into the cold, dark water below. The whole work takes perhaps 10 minutes, and is done before the rest of the village has fully begun to wake. Inside the cellars, on the colder afternoons of late January, the good wife now spends a noticeable share of her time in a slow, patient inventory of what is left. The barrels of salted pork are opened, one by one, and the small, careful question of how many weeks the remaining cuts will yet provide for is quietly considered. The shelves of stored turnips are counted. The few small remaining apples on the storage shelf are turned and counted and turned again. The careful pile of remaining flour in the small sack against the wall is measured by eye. The question that hangs quietly over every such inventory is the same. Will it be enough? It almost always is, barely, and with careful management, and with the small, steady help of a neighbor's borrowed sack of flour from time to time, but not always. Most of the older villagers can remember, somewhere in their lives, 1 or 2 winters in which it was not enough. Those winters are not spoken of, but they are remembered, and the quiet, careful counting of what is left, in late January, is the small, slow ritual by which the village reminds itself, every year, that it must not let such a winter come again. The cold mornings of late January are sharper than any the village has yet known this year. Breath, inside the cottage, rises in small, pale clouds before the good wife's face as she kneels at the hearth to wake the fire. The packed earth floor is so cold that even through the thick wool of the household's only spare blanket, laid carefully against it, the chill rises into the small bare feet of any child who must, for any reason, stand on it before the fire has been built up. Through the deep cold of late January and into the first days of February, the very youngest children of the village, the infants and the small ones, not yet 4 or 5 years old, are kept inside almost continuously. They are wrapped, in the warmest hours of the long gray afternoons, in whatever extra layers of wool or felt the household can spare, and they are set on a small low stool close to the hearth where the warm amber glow of the slow steady fire keeps them, almost without effort, in a small comfortable doze. The oldest members of the village, similarly, now spend a noticeable share of their days simply asleep. They wake late, eat small portions of warm pottage at midday, sit close to the hearth through the long gray afternoon, and return early to the warm straw beds of the upper loft. This is not idleness. It is, instead, the small, careful, ancient wisdom by which the village keeps its oldest members alive through the season. They save their warmth and their small remaining strength by simply moving as little as they can manage. Even inside the warm circle around the hearth, the air of the cottage is not entirely warm. The wattle walls, by late January, have absorbed so much of the cold of the long weeks that they have begun, in a quiet way, to give it back. The breath of any speaker still rises in small, pale clouds. The water in the wooden pail beside the door, if not used by mid-morning, may form a thin film of ice across its surface. The cottage, which through summer had been a place of shade and coolness, is now, in its small, modest way, the only thing that keeps the household from the worst of the season. The hearth, by late January, has become very nearly everything. It is the source of warmth. It is the source of cooked food. It is the source, on most afternoons, of the only useful light. The household arranges its furniture around it. Its members arrange their bodies around it. The slow, patient feeding of it, with carefully measured pieces of split oak from the slowly shrinking stack against the south wall, becomes the single small repeated ritual around which the rest of the day quietly orbits. The midday meal in the deep weeks of January is a small steady pottage of whatever the storeroom can spare. A few small turnips, peeled slowly with the household's only good knife. A small careful handful of dried peas or beans. Sometimes, when the household can spare it, a small cut of salted pork from the cellar barrel, added to the pot to give the pottage a small steady flavor. The pottage is set to simmer slowly above the hearth, and its gentle sound, in the long gray afternoons, becomes one of the few pleasant noises of the season. The household's small wooden cask of winter beer, which through December had been drawn from with reasonable freedom, is by now being drawn from with a more careful eye. A small cup at midday for the working adults, perhaps one more in the evening, and the cask is set back into its corner of the cellar with a quiet attention to how much remains. The pale, thin beer is not strong. It is, however, safer than the well water in any season, and it provides a small, steady comfort in the long gray afternoons that is otherwise difficult to find. When a household's firewood begins to run noticeably low, the small, quiet practice of borrowing from a neighbor is observed. A small bundle of split oak is brought to the door of the cottage in question, accepted with a small, careful gesture of thanks, and the matter is silently noted as a debt to be repaid in some form or other when spring permits. Most cottages in the village have, by late January, given and received some such bundle. It is not seen as charity. It is seen, rather, as the small ancient agreement by which the village survives. Once or twice through the deep weeks of January, one or two of the more enterprising men of the village will, on a clear, bright, cold morning, take a small handbow and a small bundle of arrows out to the edge of the manor wood in the hope of taking a single winter hare. The Lord, by long custom, permits this small, careful hunting, so long as it is done with patience and without disturbance. The men do not always come back with a hare. Most often, they come back with nothing at all. But on the days when they do return with a small gray winter hare slung across one shoulder, the smell of fresh roasted meat in the cottage that evening becomes one of the small, steady comforts of the season. The heaviest snowfall of the year, in places like this, almost always falls in the last week of January or the first week of February. It begins, usually, in the late gray afternoon, with a few thin scattered flakes drifting slowly past the small cottage windows, and by the early evening has thickened into a steady, patient fall that does not stop, in some years, for 2 or 3 full days. The villagers, who can hear it as a kind of soft hush against the wattle walls of their cottages, simply set another small, careful piece of oak onto the fire, draw their woolen cloaks a little closer, and wait. When the snowfall ends, sometime in the middle of the night or the early gray morning, the world that the village wakes to has been thoroughly remade. The lane between the cottages is no longer a lane. The careful firewood stacks against the south walls of each cottage are deep drifts. The well at the center of the village is a low, rounded hill of fresh snow. The whole of the village is silent, in a way that not even the deepest winter morning of the last several years has been silent, and the very few villagers who step out in the early gray morning to look do not speak. On one of the colder mornings of late January, the bailiff of the manor walks the slow, careful path through the village, knocks at 3 or 4 of the larger cottage doors, and quietly notes whether the households inside are managing. He does not stay long at any one door. He does not ask many questions. He simply nods and accepts the small, quiet reassurance that is given to him and walks slowly on. The villagers respect him in their slow, patient way for this small, careful work. Inside the great hall of the manor itself, in these deep weeks of January, the central fire pit is kept burning a little more generously than the small, careful hearths of the village cottages. 3 or 4 large oak logs, properly arranged, give a steady, tall, warm amber flame that rises into the wide, soot-blackened chimney above. The lord of the manor sits, in the late afternoons, in his usual large oak chair before this fire, often with a small, careful cup of warm, spiced wine and a small, dark book of devotional verses open across his lap. The Lord's evening, in late January, is not very different from the evening of any of the more prosperous cottagers in the village. He eats a small, careful supper of bread and a piece of roasted fowl, or sometimes of cured pork, from his own salting cellars. He listens, for an hour or so, to the slow, patient music of a small wooden harp played by one of the older serving women of the household. And by the early second hour after sundown, he too retires to his chamber above the great hall, where the curtains of his low wooden bed are drawn against the cold of the long night. The evening, in the village outside, is by now very dark and very silent. The snow that has fallen earlier in the week has muffled almost every ordinary sound. The animals in the lean-tos behind the cottages are quiet. The wind has dropped. The cold blue light that follows the brief gray afternoon settles slowly over the snow-covered roofs, and from the cold lanes outside, each cottage shows only the faintest pinprick of warm amber light around the edges of its closed door, and the slow, patient trail of pale smoke from its chimney. Sometimes, in the deepest part of a January night, the villagers in the warm dark of their straw lofts may hear, from very far across the snow-covered fields and the bare cold beechwood, the long, thin, distant cry of a wolf. The cry is faint. It is, almost without exception, very far away. It does not frighten anyone in particular. The villagers have lived with the small, steady knowledge of wolves in the further wood for as long as anyone alive can remember, and the small, quiet management of this knowledge, keep the doors closed, keep the animals in, is a thing they do in winter, almost without thinking. Inside the warm dark of the upper lofts, the villagers do not, as a rule, react to such a distant cry. The oldest among them may turn slightly in their warm straw beds. The youngest among them, half asleep, do not hear it at all. The household dog, lying close to the warmth of the banked hearth below, may briefly raise its head, may listen for a moment, and may then, with a small quiet sigh, settle itself again on its straw bed. The cry is far. The doors are closed. The fire is banked. There is nothing, in this hour, to be done. The night, in the deepest part of January, is very long. In this latitude, in this season, the slow turning of the dark over the snow-covered fields, and the dark, cold beech wood, and the small, dark village, and the small, dark manor, can extend from the late gray afternoon through to the first pale gray hint of morning for 15, 16, even 17 hours. The villagers, asleep in their warm straw lofts, do not, of course, count these hours. They simply pass through them in the small, steady warmth of their wool blankets and emerge again in the morning into the slow gray light of another January day. The villagers, in these weeks, sleep more deeply and more often than at any other time of the year. The combination of the early evening dark, the warm, steady banked hearth, the heavy wool blankets, the small, steady cup of warm pottage at midday, and the simple absence of any pressing outdoor work, all combine to produce in the household a kind of slow, steady drowsiness that by mid-evening becomes almost irresistible. The household sleeps, the fire smolders, the snow continues, in many small, careful ways, to settle, and outside, above the small, dark village and the small, dark manor and the small, dark coppice wood beyond, the pale moon of the last days of January traces slow, careful paths across the cold, deep indigo sky. The villagers, asleep beneath their wool blankets, do not see it. The pale silver light, which only the cold, dark, snow-covered fields see, is enough to mark the moment in the long winter at which something very small, very slow, very nearly imperceptible begins, in the soft pale silver of the late January air, to turn. By the first days of February, the daily life of the village has, in its slow, patient way, begun to shift. The cold is still very much present. The snow is still deep along the lanes and in the corners of the cottage yards. The well must still, every morning, be carefully broken open. But the very first hint of a small change is now noticeable on the clearer mornings, in the quality of the light itself, a slightly paler gray, a slightly earlier first appearance, a slightly later final dimming, that the older villagers, who have watched this same small turning every year of their lives, recognize without comment. The gray of February is, in this part of the world, a color all of its own. It is not the heavy, still gray of late November, which had been a thing of damp settling and cold thickening. It is, instead, a thinner, brighter gray, the gray of low cloud through which a small, steady promise of warmth, somewhere, is now beginning to be felt. The villagers do not, of course, speak of this. They simply notice it, in small, slow ways, as they go about their work. The first week of February also brings, in years when the church calendar falls that way, the beginning of Lent. The parish priest, on the appointed Wednesday, calls a small, simple service in the cold, dim nave of the village church, and the small handful of villagers who attend kneel slowly before him to receive a small, careful smudge of gray ash on the forehead. The ash is made from the burnt remnants of the previous year's palm branches, kept carefully for exactly this purpose, and the small, gentle gesture of receiving it is, in this place, observed without much ceremony. Lent, in a small medieval village, is not very different in practice from what the household has already been doing throughout the deep weeks of January. The salted pork, by this point, has been very carefully rationed for weeks. The cheese has been carefully turned and counted. The dried peas and the few small remaining apples and turnips have been measured by eye against the slow, patient passage of the days. Lent simply gives a small, steady religious order to a careful pattern of eating that the household, by necessity, has already been observing. Hunger, in a medieval village in late February, is not a dramatic thing. It is, instead, a small, quiet companion that walks beside the household through the slow gray days. The midday pottage is thinner than it had been in November. The pieces of salted pork in it are smaller. The portion of bread on the wooden trencher is a little less generous than it had been at Christmas. None of this is spoken of, because there is nothing useful to be done with the speaking of it. It is simply the way the long arc of a northern winter unfolds. The few cattle of the village have, by this stage of the winter, grown thin. They have been kept, through the deep cold weeks, on a small, careful daily portion of hay drawn from the carefully managed supply in the barn loft, and the supply itself, by late February, is beginning to grow noticeably small. The cattle are not, in any sense, hungry. They are simply, like everything else in this season, careful. They stand quietly in their byres, breath rising in small, pale clouds, and they wait, with the same slow patience as the household, for the season to turn. By the middle of February, on the warmer afternoons, the deep snow begins, in small, slow ways, to thaw. The careful drifts that have piled along the south walls of the cottages soften and settle and lose perhaps an inch a day, and the bare branches of the manor wood, which through January had stood traced delicately in white, begin to show, here and there, small, dark, wet patches where the snow has slipped from the upper limbs. The villagers, when they walk to the well or to the communal oven, now hear, instead of the dry crunch of January snow, the soft, wet sound of half-melted ice underfoot. What the thaw brings with it is mud, deep, slow, patient mud, of a kind that the village will know for the rest of February and well into March. The careful frosted lanes that through January had been hard and dry under the boot now become soft, treacherous, sticky brown stretches of half-frozen earth and water, and the villagers, when they must walk anywhere at all, choose their steps slowly and patiently. The mud is not an inconvenience to be complained of. It is, simply, the season, the slow, patient cost of the small, careful warming that is now beginning to come. Inside the cottages, in the long gray afternoons of mid-February, the men begin to turn their attention, with a slow, patient seriousness, to the question of the spring's work. The plow must be brought out in another 2 or 3 weeks, and the careful rows that it will cut into the soft thawing earth must be planned. The horses or the oxen that will draw the plow, which have through the winter been kept quietly in their barns, must be brought back slowly, into working condition. The seed corn that has been kept carefully under the dry rafters of the storage barn, in small, careful sacks of woven flax, must be checked and chosen. On the longer afternoons of mid-February, the men of the household sit close to the warm amber glow of the kitchen hearth, with the small, careful work of mending implements. The wooden handles of the spades and the hoes, which through the long autumn work had begun to loosen or to crack, are now carefully tightened or replaced. The wooden teeth of the rake are inspected, and any broken tooth is gently replaced with a fresh piece of carefully shaped hardwood. The slow, patient work is done in something close to silence, with only the occasional soft sound of a small chisel against wood and the soft hush of the fire. At the same time, by the warm amber glow of the same hearth, the iron blades of the household's small, careful collection of tools are slowly and patiently sharpened. The small whetstone of pale gray limestone is brought down from the shelf beside the hearth, set carefully on the bench, and each blade in turn, the long, thin blade of the billhook, the curved blade of the sickle, the small, heavy blade of the axe, is drawn slowly across it, with the same patient, unhurried rhythm with which every other small, steady task of the season has been done. Where a tool has, through the long autumn work, suffered damage beyond simple repair, a hoe whose worn ash handle has finally cracked beyond mending, or a spade whose wooden socket has slowly given way, the patient, slow work of fitting a new handle is now done. A fresh length of ash, dried carefully under the rafters since the previous spring, is brought down and shaped slowly to fit. The work is unhurried. There is time. The plow will not be brought out for another 2 weeks yet, and the days are now, slowly, beginning to grow long. The good wife, by the 3rd week of February, has nearly finished her own long winter work. The small, careful piles of wool that had been brought down from the upper loft in November have, over the long evenings of the past 3 months, been carded and combed and slowly spun, and the small, steady mound of finished yarn now resting in a covered wooden basket beside the hearth is the patient measure of the season's work. Some of the yarn will be woven, in March, into new cloth on the small wooden loom that stands quietly against the cottage wall. The rest will be saved. Against the south walls of each cottage, in the 3rd week of February, the careful stacks of firewood that had been so generously full in November are now noticeably small. Most households have, by careful, slow management, enough remaining oak to last until the first true warm days of March. A few households have less than that, and have, by quiet arrangement with the Lord's foresters, been permitted 1 or 2 small additional careful gatherings from the manor wood. None of this is dramatic. It is, simply, the small, steady, patient accounting by which a medieval village survives. Inside the cottages, the careful, slow management of the remaining firewood now becomes a small, steady ritual in itself. Each split log is brought to the fire slowly and with consideration. The hearth is banked, by mid-February, with even more careful attention to the small, bright heart of embers than at any earlier time of the season. There is, in this slow, patient husbandry of the household's small remaining warmth, a quiet, steady satisfaction that the older villagers know well. The winter, in its slow way, is being won. By the very last days of February, the noon sunlight, on the clearer days, has grown noticeably warm. Not warm in any modern sense, not warm enough to melt the deep snowdrifts or to dry the muddy lanes, but warm enough that a villager standing for a moment beside the south wall of his cottage, with the bright, cold, pale sun on his face, may, for the first time in months, feel a small, careful trace of true warmth on the skin. It is a small thing. It is, however, the first true small thing of its kind since the previous October, and it does not go unnoticed. And in the bare branches of the trees beyond the manor wall, in the warm late afternoons of the last week of February, the very first careful songs of the small returning birds may now occasionally be heard. They are not yet the long full songs of true spring. They are, instead, small careful testing notes sung by birds who have, perhaps, only just arrived from somewhere a little further south, or who have overwintered quietly in the deeper bare wood and have only now decided that the season is far enough turned to be worth singing into. And in the soft shaded ground beneath the bare beeches, at the very edge of the manor wood, the very first small white snowdrops are now, in the last days of February, beginning to push their fine, careful stalks slowly through the half-thawed leaf litter. There are not many of them. They are small. They are not yet in full bloom, but they are there, and the villagers, the few who walk past on their slow, careful errands, do notice them and do mark, in their slow, patient way, that the small, steady arrival of the year is now properly underway. In the village's common sheepfold, in the last days of February, a small, careful watch is now kept. The few ewes that the village keeps are heavy with their winter lambs, and the first of these lambs may, on any of the cold, pale gray mornings of the next 2 weeks, arrive. The older boy who has the daily care of the sheep, and one of the older women of the village who has long experience with such things, take it in turn to look in on the fold 3 or 4 times a day, to see whether anything has begun. And on one of the cold, pale gray mornings of the very last week of February, the first lamb of the year quietly arrives. The young shepherd, walking out to the fold in the soft pre-dawn, hears the first small, careful bleat through the wattle walls before he has even reached the door, and pushes inside to find one of the older ewes already settled on her side in the straw, the small new lamb already beside her, dark and damp in the warm amber light of the lamp he carries. He kneels slowly. He does very little. The ewe knows the work. Through the rest of the week, 2 more lambs arrive. They are watched carefully. They are kept close to their mothers in the warm, dry straw of the fold. They are not, in any way, dramatic. They are simply the small, steady, quiet beginning of the year's new flock, and the village, in its slow, patient way, marks each arrival with the small, careful satisfaction that has always belonged to this work. By the very last day of February, the fold holds 3 new lambs. The cold is not entirely gone. The winter is not entirely done. But the year, slowly, has now turned. The evenings in the last week of February are still long. The careful daily ritual of lighting the small clay oil lamp on the kitchen table, of banking the hearth, of closing the heavy oak door and dropping the iron bar into its slot, of drawing the small wooden shutters tightly closed against the cold, continues much as it has done since November. The cold has not yet truly broken. The dark is still very long. The small, slow rhythm of the household by firelight is still the rhythm of the season. But the older villagers, on the slow, careful walks they make through the muddy lanes in the warm, pale afternoons, now nod quietly to one another when they pass. They do not say anything in particular. There is, in any case, nothing in particular that needs to be said. The small, slow turning of the year is something they have lived with every winter of their long, careful lives, and the quiet, patient nodding is sufficient acknowledgement of the small, steady fact that the worst, this year, is now safely behind them. And on the last evening of February, the wind that has, through the long, deep weeks of January and the first half of February, blown almost entirely from the cold north, now begins, very slowly and very gently to shift. The change is small. The change is barely noticeable. But by the very last gray hour of the day, the small thin trails of pale smoke rising from the cottage chimneys are drifting, very gently, in a slightly different direction than they had been the day before, and the careful, slow weather sense of the older villagers takes quiet note. And outside, above the small dark village and the small dark manor and the small dark coppice wood beyond, the pale moon of the last days of February rises slowly above the bare branches and gives a faint, pale, slightly warmer silver light to the half-melted snowdrifts and the soft muddy lanes and the careful firewood stacks that have now grown noticeably very small against the south sides of each cottage. The wind has shifted, the first lambs have arrived, and the long, slow, patient work of February, almost done, drifts gently, almost imperceptibly, into the brief, quiet, almost expectant first days of March that are now, in the soft, slightly warmer silver light, just beginning. The first true March morning in the small medieval village we have, over the long course of this night, slowly come to know, is something the older villagers have been quietly waiting for. The wind has shifted properly to the south. The deep snowdrifts have softened. The half-thawed lanes are still muddy, still cold, still difficult to walk, but the warm, pale gray light of the early morning now arrives noticeably earlier than it had even a week before, and there is, in the very air itself, a small, steady promise of a season that is, after the long, careful weeks of winter, now properly turning. Through the first week of March, the slow thaw continues. The half-melted drifts along the south walls of the cottages disappear, slowly, until only a small final ridge of pale gray ice remains in the deepest shaded corners. The careful frosted lanes that through January and February had been so hard underfoot give way, almost completely, to the long brown stretches of soft cold mud that will, over the coming weeks, slowly dry. The well, which all winter has needed to be broken open every morning, no longer freezes overnight at all. The wooden plow, which through the long weeks of February has rested quietly against the dark wall of the storage barn, is now, on one of the warmer afternoons of the second week of March, slowly and carefully brought out into the soft, pale light of the open yard. The iron point is checked. The wooden handles are tested. The long oak beam that joins the plow to the ox yoke is examined for any small crack. The slow, patient work of bringing the implement back into the working life of the year is done, as so much else in this place has been done, with the same unhurried attention that the long winter itself has taught. The 2 oxen of the village, which through the long winter have stood quietly in their byre, eating their small, careful daily portion of the year's stored hay, are now, on one of the warmer mornings of the second week of March, brought slowly out into the open yard, yoked together for the first time in many months, and walked patiently in long, slow circles to ease the small stiffness of their winter rest from their broad, pale shoulders. They do not, in any way, resist this. They simply walk, as oxen walk, with the same patient, unhurried rhythm. And on one of the warmer mornings of the third week of March, the village's first true plowing of the year is finally done. The oxen are yoked. The plow is set behind them. One of the older men of the village, who has, by long custom, the small, careful responsibility of guiding the iron blade through the soft, thawing earth, takes his place behind the plow. The small, slow, patient procession sets out across the soft, muddy lane, through the open gate of the manor wall, and out into the wide, cold, pale field that has rested, quietly, beneath the snow for the whole long arc of the winter. The first furrow of the year, when it is finally cut, is cut slowly and patiently. The iron blade of the plow is lowered carefully into the soft thawing earth. The two oxen take their first slow, careful step. The blade slides forward, and the soft, dark earth that has rested quietly all winter beneath the snow opens slowly behind the plow into a long, fine, dark line, perhaps 3 inches deep, perhaps 50 paces long, the very first such line of the new working year. The slow, patient work of turning the rest of the field will, in this part of the world, take many weeks. The villagers do not, on this first day, try to do too much. The oxen are not yet, after the long winter, in full working condition. The earth is not yet, in many places, properly thawed, so the work is done slowly. A few long lines are cut, the oxen are unyoked, the plow is rested, and the small, slow, patient procession returns to the village in the soft, warm cream of the late afternoon. Back in the village, the cottagers, those without ox or plow of their own, are at the same time doing the small, careful spring work of their own small kitchen gardens. The small, careful sacks of dried peas, the small, careful sacks of the previous year's leek seed, the small, careful sacks of bean seed are brought down from their dry shelves in the storage rooms and are slowly and patiently set, by hand, into the small, soft brown beds of the cottage garden behind each house. The work is again unhurried. There is again time. The goat, which through the long, deep weeks of winter has been kept entirely in the warm, dark lean-to behind the cottage, is now, on the warmer afternoons of mid-March, slowly led out into the small green patch of the manor common land beyond the village wall, and tethered on a long, careful rope to a small wooden stake. The first new grass of the year, which has, in small thin patches, begun to push through the soft brown earth, is slowly and gratefully eaten. The goat does not, in any visible way, celebrate. The goat simply eats. The few small children of the village, who through the deep cold weeks of January have been kept almost entirely inside, are now, on the warmer afternoons of mid-March, finally allowed out into the lanes again. They walk slowly after so many weeks indoors. They blink slowly in the soft pale light. They notice, in their small, slow way, the new lambs in the fold, the first green grass on the common, the warm cream light on the south walls of their cottages, and they do not, by any visible measure, become excited. They simply, slowly, look. By the end of the third week of March, the soft brown muddy lanes between the cottages have, on the warmer days, finally begun to dry. The earth is no longer the wet, sticky, slow surface that the village has been walking on since the first thaws of February. It is, now, simply earth, soft, cool, dry enough to walk easily, and the small villagers who walk it now, on their slow, careful errands, no longer choose their steps with quite the same patient attention they had needed to choose them with through the long, muddy weeks of late winter. And in the bare branches of the trees beyond the manor wall, in the warm cream late afternoons of the last week of March, the small, careful testing songs of the small returning birds that had been heard, only briefly and only occasionally, in late February, have now grown into something close to true song. They are not yet the long, full songs of full spring. They are, however, the small, steady promise of those songs, and the slow, patient cottager standing in his small kitchen garden in the warm cream light pauses sometimes to listen. In the small village sheepfold, in the warm cream afternoons of the last week of March, the small new lambs that had arrived through the very cold last days of February are now, finally, allowed out. In the careful watch of the village shepherd boy, onto the small green patch of the common where the first new grass of the year is beginning, slowly, to spread. The lambs do not, in any way, race or play. They simply walk, slowly, beside their mothers, and they begin, with the same small, slow attention that all of medieval life seems to involve, to nibble at the new grass. The evenings in the last week of March are still cool. The household still lights the small clay oil lamp on the kitchen table well before the simple supper of pottage and bread is finished. The hearth is still banked, every night, with the same patient care that the long winter has taught. The heavy oak door is still closed against the cool blue dusk, and the iron bars still dropped into its slot. The small, slow, careful rhythm of the household by firelight, which has held the village together through the long arc of the winter, holds it together still. On one of the warmer afternoons of the very last week of March, a single careful traveler, a small thin man with a small thin bundle slung across one shoulder, appears at the gate of the manor wall and asks the gatekeeper for a small night's rest and a small bowl of evening pottage in exchange for what news he carries. The gatekeeper, who has not seen a traveler in the village since the snows began in late November, nods slowly and lets him in. The lord of the manor, who is informed of the arrival in his usual quiet way, agrees to see the man after supper. The news the traveler carries, when it is at last delivered to the lord in the warm amber light of the great hall after supper, is not, in any particular way, dramatic. There has been, somewhere to the south, a small dispute between two minor lords over a contested boundary stone. There has been, somewhere to the north, a small, unusually warm winter, and the rivers have come up early. There has been, in some distant abbey, the slow, patient death of an old abbot who had been long expected to die. None of this affects the village. The Lord listens quietly, thanks the traveler carefully, and orders him a small additional cup of wine. And by the very last days of March, the small medieval village we have, over the long course of this night, slowly come to know, has, in its slow, patient way, fully settled into the small, steady rhythm of the early spring. The plowing continues. The kitchen gardens continue. The lambs grow. The first true green of the year continues, very slowly, to spread along the hedge banks and the south-facing edges of the manor wall. The village does not, in any dramatic way, celebrate this. The village simply, slowly, continues. Inside the cottages, in the warm amber light of the evening hearth, the careful small rituals of the household continue much as they have done since November. The supper is eaten slowly. The dishes are gathered slowly. The fire is banked slowly. The candles are blown out slowly. The household, one by one, climbs slowly to the warm straw lofts above the kitchen end and settles slowly under the heavy wool blankets and slowly closes its eyes. And in the warm amber glow of the kitchen end of the cottage, the small careful work of banking the hearth, of preparing the small bright heart of the household's warmth for another night, is done slowly, as it has been done every night in this village for as many winters as anyone alive can remember. The bright embers are gathered slowly. The thick blanket of pale gray ash is drawn slowly across them. The fire is left to smolder slowly through the long, cool night, and in the small, dim cottage, in the warm amber glow of the slow-banked fire, the youngest child of the household, who has, through the long arc of the winter we have just spent together, grown perhaps half an inch and learned perhaps 3 new words, falls slowly and quietly into the warm, careful sleep that small children fall into when the day has been long and the fire has been warm. And again, The lantern on the small oak table beside her flickered. And in the small dim cottage, in the warm amber glow of the slow-banked fire, the old goodwife of the household, who has, through the long arc of this winter we have just spent together, kept the hearth burning steady and the household carefully fed, and the long, careful winter rhythm of the spinning slowly going through every long, cool evening, now rests her hand for a moment on the small, worn wooden distaff and lets it lower slowly to her side. And again, the spinning beside her slowed, and in the great hall of the manor, in the warm amber glow of the slow-banked central fire, the lord of the manor, who has, through the long arc of this winter we have just spent together, kept his small, careful court, and his small, careful household, and his small, careful watch over the village outside his wall, now lowers his small cup of warm spiced wine slowly to the worn arm of his large oak chair. And again, the cup beside him was set quietly down. And in the small dim church across the small village green, in the warm amber glow of the single small altar candle that has been left by the parish priest to burn slowly through the long, cool spring night, the small, steady, warm amber flame catches the worn, pale stone of the cold nave walls and lays a small, slow, soft light across the empty wooden benches before it. And again, the small flame on the altar was steady. And outside, in the small, dark village we have, through the long arc of this winter, slowly come to know, the heavy oak doors of the cottages are, one by one, closed for the night. The iron bars are dropped, one by one, into their slots. The small wooden shutters are drawn, one by one, against the cool blue dusk. The faint, warm amber pinpricks of light around the edges of each door grow gradually smaller, gradually softer, gradually fewer. And again, in the village, the doors, one by one, were quietly closing. And outside, above the small dark village and the small dark manor and the small dark coppice wood beyond, the soft, warm, pale silver moon of the very last days of March rises slowly, very slowly, above the bare oak branches and gives a faint, pale, slightly warmer silver light to the soft brown muddy lanes and the dry south walls and the empty firewood stacks that have, after the long, careful winter we have just spent together, almost entirely been used. The wind is gentle, the animals are silent. The villagers, one by one, settle slowly into the warm straw beds of the upper lofts. The fire smolders, the lantern flickers, the spinning rests, the cup is set down, the small flame is steady, and the doors, one by one, in the small dark village are quietly closing. And the long, slow work of this winter, now finally done, drifts gently, almost imperceptibly, into the small, steady, patient, slow promise of the spring that is now, in the soft, warm silver light, finally beginning to arrive. You've reached the end of tonight's archive. If you're still awake, thank you for staying. And if you drifted off somewhere in the dark, then it did its work. Rest now. The next chapter will be here when you are. Sleep well. This has been Archive Whispers.